She stood in front of cameras, crying, her voice shaking, begging the world to help her. And everyone did. Before we start, if you're interested in true crime cases where appearances are dangerously misleading, make sure to like the video. This story fooled an entire nation. In October 1994, in Union, South Carolina, Susan Smith called the police with a terrifying story. She claimed her car had been hijacked at a stoplight, and inside the car were her 2 young sons. According to her, a man forced her out of the vehicle and drove away with the children still strapped into their seats. It was every parent's worst nightmare. Susan appeared devastated. She cried during interviews. She pleaded directly to the alleged kidnapper to return her boys. Candlelight vigils were held. Volunteers searched day and night. The media broadcast her face across the country. America watched and believed her. Police launched a massive manhunt. Roadblocks were set up. Tips flooded in. Sketches were released. The entire community mobilized around one grieving mother. Nothing about Susan raised immediate suspicion. She fit the image people trusted: soft-spoken, emotional, broken. But beneath that image, something didn't add up. Her story had small gaps. Details shifted slightly. Emotions sometimes felt rehearsed. But in the middle of collective panic, no one wanted to question a mother in pain. By the end of this part, one thing becomes clear: the most powerful disguise isn't silence. It's sympathy. As the days passed, the search intensified, and so did the doubts. Investigators replayed Susan's account repeatedly, listening not just to what she said, but how she said it. The timeline felt tight. Too tight. Certain details didn't align with traffic patterns, witness statements, or basic logic. Then the cracks started to show. Susan's descriptions of the alleged carjacker shifted subtly. Height changed. Clothing changed. Direction of travel changed. None of it was dramatic enough to halt the search, but it unsettled detectives quietly comparing notes. More troubling was her emotional inconsistency. In some moments, she appeared inconsolable. In others, eerily calm. She cooperated with police, but only to a point. Certain questions made her defensive. Certain follow-ups were brushed aside. It wasn't resistance. It was control. Behind the scenes, investigators uncovered mounting personal stress, financial problems, relationship turmoil, a growing fear of abandonment. Her life was unraveling, and the timing was impossible to ignore. The community still stood behind her. No one wanted to imagine the alternative. The idea that a mother could lie about something like this felt unthinkable. Sympathy protected her more effectively than silence ever could. But detectives are trained to sit with uncomfortable possibilities. And one possibility was becoming harder to ignore. What if the story wasn't missing a few details? What if it was built to hide something far worse? The turning point didn't come from a dramatic discovery. It came from pressure. After days of non-stop searching, interviews, and national attention, investigators confronted Susan more directly. They laid out inconsistencies, shifting descriptions, impossible timing. They didn't accuse her. They waited. Slowly, the performance crumbled. Her story stalled. Her answers shortened. The tears came, but no longer matched the questions. Behind closed doors, detectives applied steady pressure. No shouting. No threats. Silence did the work. Susan broke. She confessed there was no carjacker. No stranger. No kidnapping. Instead, she described driving her car to a nearby lake in the early hours of the morning, her 2 sons asleep in the backseat. She let the vehicle roll into the water and watched it disappear. The confession stunned the nation. The image of the grieving mother collapsed instantly, replaced by a reality almost impossible to process. Search efforts stopped. Vigils turned into shock. Sympathy turned into disbelief. Worse still was her motive. It wasn't panic in the moment. It was planning. Fear of losing a relationship. A belief that her children stood in the way of the future she wanted. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't desperation. It was a choice. By the end of this part, one truth is unavoidable. The danger was never outside the car. It was in the driver's seat the entire time. Once the confession became public, the reaction was explosive. Shock turned into rage. Sympathy into betrayal. The media replayed Susan's tearful pleas on loop, now seen as performance. What once looked like grief felt calculated. Investigators retraced her movements, measured distances, timed the drive, rebuilt the night minute by minute. The evidence confirmed the confession: deliberate, controlled, planned. In court, Susan Smith appeared subdued, far from the emotional figure the public remembered. Prosecutors presented a motive rooted in fear of abandonment and desire for a different life. The belief that removing her children would remove her problems. That framing enraged the public even more. There was no moral ambiguity left, no room for doubt. The focus wasn't how the crime happened, but how easily trust had been exploited. Testimony sealed the case. Details too precise. Timelines too exact. A confession that matched the evidence perfectly. The woman who once begged the world for help now stood as the reason help had been needed at all. The verdict came swiftly. Susan Smith was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for decades. The court rejected any attempt to frame the crime as momentary weakness. The evidence told a different story: intention, planning, choice. In the aftermath, the country struggled to understand how something so horrific had been hidden behind convincing grief. Susan hadn't just lied to police. She had manipulated a nation's empathy. Her case permanently changed how missing children investigations are handled. Media appeals became more cautious. Law enforcement grew more skeptical of emotional narratives. The uncomfortable truth settled in. Even the most trusted image can be manufactured. For the victims, her children, justice could never mean restoration. Their lives became a lesson the world learned too late. Psychologists later described the case as a chilling example of narcissistic thinking combined with fear of abandonment. When desire outweighs responsibility, morality collapses. This story forces one of the hardest realizations in true crime. Danger doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it wears a familiar face. Sometimes it asks for sympathy. What made her story believable for so long? Share your thoughts below.